December 2022. "Come on, open up, I know you're in there." The man's voice was harsh and determined, accompanied by a fist pounding against the flimsy caravan door. Inside, Jenna lay curled on her sagging mattress, wrapped tightly in a thick duvet, desperately trying to retain the sparse warmth within. So frugal had her life become that heating was now an unaffordable luxury. On bitterly cold days like this, she stayed in bed, cloaked in layers, sheltering from the chill. At 59, with no savings, no pension, and no realistic hope of finding work in Pencarven, her once prosperous Cornish village, Jenna's existence was now stripped to the bare bones, with a future that had never looked bleaker. And now the man outside had come to evict her from her caravan, her final refuge in a world scarcely recognizable from the one in which she had grown up. His hammering refused to let up, and neither did the freezing December rain that had been pounding on the metal roof all morning, creating a merciless racket she could do nothing to block out. She couldn't even switch on the radio or television to drown out the noise. Her electricity had been cut off 3 days ago, thanks to the man outside. Even her phone, her last link to civilization, had finally succumbed to its fading battery despite her attempts to eke it out. It was no use. She was going to have to face him. She knew exactly who he was and why he'd come, which made this all the more painful. How had her life ended up in this state? Her parents, her grandparents, and generations more of her family who had lived and died here in Pencarven would have been horrified to see her reduced to this. With the village almost completely stripped of its heritage, she was the final original resident left, the last woman standing, as she often called herself with grim pride. But today, it seemed her long defiant fight against the changes she was powerless to prevent was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. "Hurry up!" barked her visitor, impatience verging towards anger as his fist struck the door ever louder. Jenna was hit by the chill as she dragged herself out of bed, her aching body protesting with every reluctant movement. Cold and undernourished, she barely had any food left other than a few tins, and with the power out, no means of cooking even the little she had. She didn't dare glance at the mirror, knowing her grey hair would be a tangled mess, her clothes a mismatched collection from the charity shops of Camelford. Sporting an old fleece advertising a long-defunct surf shop in Newquay, she was about as far from the carefree, sunlit days of her youth as it was possible to be. Shuffling to the door, she noticed a new tear in one of her socks, her big toe now poking through. It was just another mark of poverty, one her spiteful visitor who revelled in her suffering would doubtless find gratifying. "All right, I'm coming," she called, raising her voice, at which point his hammering finally stopped. She braced herself for the inevitable conflict to come, then unlocked the door and pulled it open. An icy gust and a spray of rain burst inside, splashing her already cold cheeks as she came face to face with her tormentor, a man she had come to despise despite the blood they shared. Elliot Cadwallader, owner of the caravan park and an opulent mansion up on the cliffs, looked every inch the entitled heir. He stood unbothered by the downpour beneath a sleek blue and green umbrella emblazoned with the words "The Cadwallader Country Club and Spa Plus," one of many local enterprises that belonged to him. He didn't technically own the whole of Pencarven, but given his wealth and influence, he might as well have. His dark hair was immaculately styled, his face clean-shaven, and his whole appearance meticulously groomed, as always. He wore a tailored blue Italian suit, custom-made, with a silk tie in the club colours that perfectly matched his umbrella. The overall effect was of a successful, charming businessman, but it did not impress Jenna. His fine appearance meant nothing given the utter contempt he reserved for her on the increasingly rare occasions when they encountered each other. Oddly, these meetings often left her with a fleeting sense of satisfaction. Elliot was a man who expected to get his way, using his wealth and power to bend people to his will. She remembered him years ago at his father's funeral, boasting that he could now buy whatever and whoever he wanted. The memory fueled her resolve to resist him. He might have bought up most of Pencarven, but he couldn't buy her, and she knew that infuriated him. Her resistance, though admirable, wasn't doing her any favours. The prime reason she was enduring such hardship was her refusal to play along with his plans. It was a stubbornness that had cost her greatly, but she felt she owed it to her family, to her roots, and to all those who had come before her to make a stand against him, however futile it might ultimately be. "What the hell are you still doing here?" he said, his voice sharp with disdain as he peered inside. "You're supposed to be gone by today." "Won't you come in?" she said, injecting a playful note into her voice. She might as well wind him up a bit in what little time she had left. "I'd offer you a cup of tea, but some vindictive tosser seems to have cut off my electricity." He glanced around her modest living space, making no effort to disguise his disgust. "I'm not sure if I should," he replied with a condescending look. "I might catch something. But since it's teeming down out here, I suppose I'll have to risk it." His remarks were unjustified because although the caravan and its furnishings were old, she kept things as clean and tidy as she could. She stood back and gestured for him to enter. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked cheerily, determined not to let him see the desperation of her situation. "I'll stand, thanks," he said, stepping inside gingerly in his polished Gucci loafers, as though he might tread in something unpleasant. "So, what's this about?" she asked, adopting an air of innocence as if his visit was unexpected. "You know full well what it's about," he replied. "I handed you the eviction notice myself 6 days ago." "Yes, on Christmas Day," she said, her voice laden with fake cheeriness. "And there was I thinking you'd come bearing gifts for your big sister." "Half-sister," he corrected her coolly. "And anyone looking at us wouldn't even think we were that, thank goodness. You're an embarrassment. Let's face it, we may have been born from the same woman, but we both know which side the best genes came from. I was sired by a superior stallion, shall we say." "Is that so?" she countered, her tone sharpening. "If pedigree were based on wealth alone, maybe you'd have a point. But your father wasn't half the man mine was. Yours was a privileged, entitled narcissist, rather like you, funnily enough. Ever heard the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? My father was a decent, hard-working man who cared for his family in a way you'll never understand. Your father was a weak-willed drunk who cared for you so much he took his own life when things got a bit tough," replied Elliot with his trademark sneer that she'd seen hundreds of times before. "Our mother was lucky to escape when she did. She did much better the second time around, and I'm living proof of that." "Proof of what? How to be the vilest human being to ever walk the earth? And that's saying something considering your father's track record." "You can insult my character all you like, but let's be honest. I'm the one who has everything and you're the one with nothing. So who's really winning here?" "It's not a competition," replied Jenna, hating how his words struck home. She wasn't motivated by money or possessions, but that didn't take away the sheer injustice of it all. "Life is totally a competition," he replied smugly. "It's one huge game, winners and losers. Think of it like Monopoly, and I'm just better at it than you." "Oh, are you?" she replied, keen to clarify a thing or two. "Is it a fair game if you start the game with hotels on Mayfair and Park Lane and all the money in the bank? You didn't earn any of that. It all came from being the son of the famous, or rather infamous, Blake Cadwallader." "You can't blame me for that," he replied. "If you'd been a little nicer to my father after he married our mother, maybe he wouldn't have cut you out of the will." "Cut me out? I wouldn't have taken a penny from him if he'd offered it. Not after the things he did when he first came to Pencarven." Care to hazard a guess at what his idea of me being nice to him was when I was 20 and he was 40? You don't know the half of it. If I'd been stronger then, I would have exposed him for the man he really was. Then perhaps he wouldn't have destroyed my family, my village, and my way of life. It's my village too, you know. I grew up here, and I rather prefer it the way it is, now all the peasants have been cleared out. You were hardly ever here. Blake packed you off to boarding school when you were 7. Then it was straight to Cambridge. You don't even have a Cornish accent. Whatever, said Elliot, dismissing her words with yet another sneer. And you can say what you like about my father. I've heard it all before, and it's all lies. Oh, so you've heard the rumours then, replied Jenna, with the delicious feeling that she was starting to get under his skin. Hearsay and jealousy, he replied defensively. Every successful man comes up against it. Whatever you're referring to, there's no proof anything happened. Jenna laughed triumphantly. You see, your choice of words betrays you. You deny the evidence, not the facts. That's what the guilty always do. You can't prove anything, and none of it matters now anyway. He's been dead for 5 years, and now I own everything that was his, including this caravan park, what's left of it. You're the only one left here now, you know that. Only because you bought all the others off, said Jenna, a touch of resentment returning to her voice as she thought about her last few friends who had lived in the caravan park. They'd each sworn to stand by her allies, her community, they said. But in the end, the allure of Elliot's cash had proven too much. One by one, they had deserted her, deciding to take their chances elsewhere, leaving her alone to hold her ground. You were offered the same deal as them, he said. It's only your stubbornness and pride that's kept you here, and look where it's got you. You don't even own this caravan, you only rent it. You could have walked away from here months ago with 20 grand in your pocket. Most of the others settles for even less. Now your time's up and you've got to leave anyway, and I don't have to give you a penny. I'll be all right, said Jenna, trying to sound resilient, though she was consumed with despair about what the future might hold. All right was a far stretch from reality. Oh, really? Replied Elliot, his tone dripping with scorn. And where exactly will you go? You've got no money, no home, no job. Face it, you're finished, Jenna. I had to pretend to be nice to you while our mother was still alive, but you can rot in hell now for all I care. I've still got my pride, she replied, grasping for some shred of dignity, even though she could feel how hollow the words sounded. Pride wouldn't shelter her from the elements or put food on the table. Pretty soon she wouldn't even have a table. But pride was all she had left, the one part of herself that Elliot hadn't been able to strip away from her in the way he had from everybody else. Well, I hope it keeps you warm at night, he replied, echoing her thoughts. Now, I suggest you gather up your meagre belongings and get out before this dismal sardine tin gets towed off to the scrapyard. The sooner I get it out of the way, the better. The bulldozers move in on Tuesday to start demolishing the old clubhouse. After that, we'll begin the golf course development in earnest. Another essential component of your millionaire's playground, she replied, thinking of the caravan park in happier times when it had been owned by her uncle and packed with holidaymakers in the summer. She had even worked here for a while as a children's entertainer. Oh, it's not just a vanity project. This is going to be one of the most immaculately manicured links courses in the world. We've already got the DP World Tour interested in holding an event here, and who knows, maybe we could even host the Open. Donald Trump may think he got his hand on one of the crown jewels of British golf when he bought Turnberry, but he'll be seething with envy when he sees this place. Maybe, she said, but you haven't built it yet. And my lease doesn't run out until midnight. So as far as the law's concerned, you can't kick me out until then. If it hadn't been for you, we could have started work here weeks ago, he replied, This caravan is in the exact spot where the bar's going to be in the new clubhouse. Well, I'm sorry I've been such a thorn in your side, she replied. It almost felt worth putting herself in this mess just for the satisfaction of knowing she had held up his plans. Yes, well, if I were you, I would leave now, while it's still daylight. At least then you'd have time to find a bed for the night. Perhaps one of your pauper friends in the village will take pity on you. You know very well they've all gone, said Jenna. You said as much earlier. I'm the only original resident left. You and your father before you have driven us all out. I hope you're proud of yourself. It's called progress, Jenna, he replied with a patronizing look. If your sort were in charge, we'd still be living in mud huts and riding horses. It's not my fault that people like you can't afford to live here anymore. Oh, it's your fault, all right, she retorted, her voice rising as she thought of the years spent watching the traditional way of life in her village be ruthlessly swept away. But nothing can change the legal fact that you can't kick me out of here before midnight. So despite all your wealth and influence, right now, I'm still the one in charge. So get out of my caravan! She drew strength from the anger that had sparked inside her and, without even thinking about it, moved toward him, pushing him towards the door. His surprise at this was evident. He hadn't expected this amount of resistance. Go on, get out, she said, her voice full of fire as he raised his arms to shield himself. Or are you going to use your physical strength against me, the puny, defenseless woman, powerless to resist? That was your dad's style, after all. He got a kick out of it. He stumbled backwards, caught off guard by her boldness, and she reached behind him to yank open the caravan door, propelling him outside with one last shove. You're only delaying the inevitable, he shouted as she slammed the door in his face, his voice muffled by the pounding rain. You're finished, Jenna! Finished, do you hear me? She didn't answer, but swiftly locked the door, her hands shaking as she turned the key. Outside, the rain continued to batter down, hammering on the thin metal roof. A few seconds later, there was another knock, softer this time. Jenna? I think I left my umbrella in there, he called, his tone almost pleading. Can I have it? She glanced at the discarded umbrella he'd put by the door. You can collect it tomorrow, along with the caravan, she shouted with great satisfaction. Stupid cow! He shouted back as he stomped away. She watched through the narrow window as he made a dash through the rain towards his luxury Mercedes, parked about 30 yards away by the derelict clubhouse. His gentle stride soon turned into a sprint as he rushed to escape the rain, drenching his perfectly coiffed hair and designer suit. She couldn't help but break into laughter as he suddenly slipped, landing hard on the muddy ground. When he rose, she was delighted to see the huge brown stains now marring his right sleeve and the seat of his trousers. That would serve the bastard right. This moment of amusement was sweet, but brief, as thoughts of the uncertainty that lay ahead returned while she watched him drive away. By tonight, she'd have to leave the caravan, and possibly the village too, where she had lived her entire life. Had it all been worth it? Standing her ground against Blake, and now his son all these years? She liked to think so, but in truth it had brought her little but hardship. She sank back on the bed, wrapping the quilt around her as she pondered what she was going to do. She couldn't stay in Pencarven, that much was clear. Homelessness, the word itself sent a shiver down her spine, was a very real and terrifying prospect, no longer something that just happened to other people. Now it was happening to her. Maybe she could go into Camelford, beg for help from the council and throw herself on the mercy of the system. But it was Saturday, and with Monday a bank holiday, would there even be anyone available to help her before Tuesday? That left the grim prospect of at least 2 nights sleeping rough. A terrifying thought at the best of times, but in the bitter cold of winter it was almost unthinkable. She drifted into a shallow sleep for an hour or two, waking to find that the rain had ceased and the sun was tentatively breaking through the clouds. Her stomach was rumbling, and she rummaged through the cupboards until she unearthed a half-forgotten tub of Pringles several weeks beyond their best-before date. It wasn't much of a meal and they tasted stale, but it would have to do. Her only alternative was eating cold baked beans out of a tin, and she couldn't face that. Feeling claustrophobic in the cold, lonely caravan, Jenna decided she needed some fresh air. She wrapped her raincoat tightly over the top of her fleece and stepped out into the now sunny afternoon. If this was to be her last day in Pencarven, then she wanted to take a final look around, to reminisce about happier times and remind herself of what she and everyone else who used to live here had lost. The caravan park, once alive with laughter, music and the scent of barbecues on long summer nights, was now a bleak sprawl of overgrown grass and abandoned pitches. Her caravan was the last, a lone survivor stubbornly defying the relentless advance of change. Soon it too would be gone, swept aside to make way for Elliot's grandiose plans. She began her descent along the narrow winding road that led from the park towards the seafront. The road itself was unchanged, its curves and dips familiar under her feet just as they had always been. The familiar scent of sea salt assailed her nostrils, allowing her to believe for a moment that nothing had changed. But as she grew closer to the village, she knew that her illusions would soon be shattered. As she approached the beach, Jenna paused at a bend in the road, which was a great vantage point from which to observe the bay. The coastline remained as breathtaking as ever. The cliffs at either end framed the crescent-shaped beach before the endless stretch of the Atlantic met the sky at the horizon. It was a stunning view that delighted all who saw it, many claiming it was one of the most beautiful sights in England. But that view now came at a cost, one which only the wealthy could afford to pay. She moved on, descending towards sea level. Her footsteps carried her past the beach, where she remembered families with deck chairs and windbreaks, while children shrieked as they splashed in the waves. Many of the families had stayed at the caravan park, when this was a thriving resort, alive with the vibrant spirit of the school summer holidays. She thought about her sweetheart, Alfie, and the surf shack he had talked about building, a construction that never came to fruition after fate had taken him from the world at a tragically young age. Further along, she arrived at the weathered stone wall separating the beach from the harbour and approached the site of what had once been Shelley's Cafe. Gone were the red-checked tablecloths and the chatter and gossip of locals catching up over endless cups of tea. In its place stood a sleek coffee house boasting exotic brews and exorbitant prices. A blackboard out front advertised a raspberry mocha latte for £7. It was a far cry from the 10p cups of tea Jenna remembered as a child. Next, she passed the former chip shop, now transformed into a trendy tapas bar with minimalist decor and a name she could barely read in its flowery italic font, let alone pronounce. She thought of the days of generous portions of thick chips and battered cod wrapped in paper, enjoyed by pensioners and children on the seafront under the gaze of watching seagulls ready to pounce on the unwary. It seemed unbelievable that there was no longer anywhere you could get takeaway fish and chips in Pencarven. The amusement arcade, once a haven for teenagers and a shelter on rainy days for all, had vanished entirely. In its place stood an art gallery, its pristine windows displaying abstract paintings that looked like random splatters to her untrained eye. She remembered the rattle of coins when the fruit machines paid out, the flashing lights of the pinball machines, and the young men competing for the highest score on the video games. She had also enjoyed playing them, particularly a game called Asteroids, at which she had frequently beaten Alfie. She continued along the seafront road, looking up at the spire of St. Piran's Church, built higher up in the village, which was set on several levels due to the steep nature of the slopes behind the seafront. Although Jenna was not religious, she could still feel keenly a sense of loss at what had become of the old building. The 11th century construction, once the heart of the community, was now an exclusive restaurant with a Michelin-starred chef promising an immersive dining experience. The stained glass windows remained, but instead of casting colourful light onto pews and parishioners, they illuminated elegantly set tables and diners completely disconnected from the village's history. The bell tower had long been silent. No longer did it toll to mark the hours or call the faithful to gather. Turning away, she headed toward the harbour. The old fishing boats had vanished, replaced by sleek yachts bobbing gently in the water behind a robust seawall that hadn't existed in her youth, leaving the village vulnerable to flooding. It was here, dead centre of the harbour area, where her family's pub and her home for the first 20 years of her life stood. To her disgust, it was now called the Gilded Mermaid, with a pretentious arty sign promoting the new name. To her, it would never be anything other than the Fisherman's Arms. The building's structure was the same, but its soul had been sacrificed on the altar of progress, like everywhere else in this over-gentrified place. She couldn't even bring herself to go in anymore, but still paused outside the entrance. She could hear that it was busy inside, which was understandable in the afternoon on New Year's Eve, but it wouldn't be full of the sort of people she had any desire to mix with. And in any case, she didn't have any money. The pub's former name was apt, as it truly was busy with fishermen back then, with their thick, chunky jumpers and straggly beards, downing pints of cider and real ale in front of the fireplace. They were long gone, but hadn't been replaced by mermaids. Now it was filled with the wealthy, the filthy rich as she thought of them. Some stayed in overpriced Airbnbs, others were the new residents who had bought their way into Pencarven at obscene prices. Then there was the second home brigade, who popped in for the holiday season before buggering off back to London until Easter. They contributed very little to the local community, if it could even still be called a community. The pub, or wine bar as it now styled itself, also had a board outside, advertising cocktails with ludicrously fanciful names at £10 a pop. How much the pub charged for a pint these days, Jenna had no idea, but if the coffee was £7 at the cafe, she couldn't imagine getting much change from a tenner. Not that a £10 note would be of any use, as there was a sign outside stating that they no longer accepted cash. She continued to the far end of the harbour, where some faded graffiti marked the wall. Years ago, someone had scrawled "Emmett's Go Home" in yellow paint, an appeal that had fallen on deaf ears. Beyond here was the main road in and out of Pencarven, winding steeply as it descended into the village. Jenna paused by the harbour wall, looking to where the southwest coast path stretched along the cliffs, connecting Pencarven to the other villages scattered along this rugged coastline. It was a windy day and the tide was high. Out beyond the shelter of the harbour, waves were crashing with great force against the rocks at the far end of the bay. The wind whipped at Jenna's hair, carrying flecks of salt spray that peppered her face too. Turning her gaze back to the village, she thought of her parents, of Alfie, and of all those who had once lived here. Her only comfort was that most of them had been spared having to see this. Jenna closed her eyes, letting the salty air fill her lungs as the question, "What am I going to do?" echoed in her mind, empty and unanswered. For a brief, hopeless moment she considered throwing herself into the sea. From where she stood, she saw no future, no way forward. But she didn't want to give Elliot the satisfaction. No, whatever it took, she would survive, somehow. When she opened her eyes again, she was surprised by the presence of a woman standing in front of her. And not just any woman, but one Jenna instantly recognized. She was staring into the face of Wendy Wood, one of the most famous British pop stars of the last 4 decades. "Hello, Jenna," said Wendy, her voice friendly and unassuming, as though speaking to an old friend. Jenna's shock wasn't because of seeing someone famous in Pencarven. They flitted in and out all the time. Over the Christmas season alone, she'd spotted a former Spice Girl, one half of a popular comedy duo, and a presenter from Dragon's Den. But those people kept themselves in their elite bubble, barely acknowledging the existence of ordinary folk like her. So for one of them to go out of their way to speak to her now was unprecedented. How How do you know my name? Stammered Jenna. What possible business could the legendary Wendy Wood have with her? I'm here to help, replied Wendy, her iconic spiky blonde hair and battered leather jacket giving her a timeless rock star look. Despite her 40 years in the music business, she still looked every inch the rebel Jenna had idolized as a teenager. The feeling of awe was unmistakable, but Jenna's negative perception of the rich and famous who came to Pencarven tempered this with caution and suspicion. Help? Why would someone like you want to help someone like me? Replied Jenna. Are you here to join in the New Year's celebrations with your rich friends? I'm not here with anyone, and I've no more desire to mix with the sort of people I've seen down here than you have, said Wendy, trying to reassure her. I came here specifically to see you. I travelled down last night to make sure I had plenty of time to find you today. Well, I don't need anyone's help. If I wanted help, I'd have given in to my half-brother when he tried to buy me off a few months ago. But I'd rather die than take anything from him. And how's that working out for you? Asked Wendy, casting her eyes over Jenna's raggedy attire. Look, I don't know what you think you want with me, or even why you've come here. But whatever it is, you've had a wasted journey. Come on, Jenna, hear me out. It's bloody freezing out here. Let me buy you a coffee and we'll discuss it. I'm not a charity case, insisted Jenna, though she had to admit the thought of a lovely warming hot drink after 3 days without a kettle was appealing, even if it meant setting foot in one of the new businesses she had boycotted in protest at the changes. And I'm not a charity, said Wendy. Believe me, what I've got to offer you is better than anything money can buy. I'm living proof of it. So come on, let's go and get in the warm and talk about it. Realizing she had nothing to lose and curious as to why Wendy had gone to all this trouble to find her, Jenna swallowed her pride and complied. Together they walked back along the harbour towards the pretentious coffee shop she had passed earlier. She was relieved to see it wasn't too busy inside, and as they took a table, she worried she might have been rude before. Wendy seemed genuine enough, so perhaps she should try to make amends. Listen, I'm sorry if I was a little brusque earlier, said Jenna. It's just that I was a bit taken aback when you approached me. I mean, people like you don't usually talk to people like me. If by that you mean the sort of people who come to Pencarven, then please don't tar me with the same brush as them. I'm more than aware of what goes on down here. There's a guy I follow on YouTube who's done a stack of videos about the reality of life in Cornwall. He goes around different places interviewing the locals about how things have changed. What locals? Asked Jenna as she sipped gratefully at her large cappuccino. I'm the only one left. That explains why he couldn't find anyone to talk to when he came here a couple of months ago, said Wendy. It wasn't always like this, said Jenna. When I was growing up back in the 70s and 80s, Pencarven was a wonderful place to live. Then it all changed. I can almost pinpoint the exact moment. It wasn't by any chance in 1983, was it? As a matter of fact, it was, said Jenna, wondering how Wendy seemed to know so much about her. Now, how could you possibly have known that? It would probably be easier if I showed you rather than explain, replied Wendy. Hold out your left arm. Why? Asked Jenna. What are you going to do? Nothing bad, trust me, said Wendy, looking her straight in the eye. Mesmerized by the gaze, Jenna complied. There was something very convincing about Wendy that was persuading her that this was the right thing to do. Wendy held out her arm, and as Jenna watched, an ornately carved golden bracelet appeared. Then, seemingly alive, it detached itself from her and slithered across her hand towards Jenna, whose fingertips were lightly brushing the end of Wendy's. The bracelet was transferring itself to her, and disconcerting as this ought to have been, Jenna felt no fear. Within a couple of seconds, the bracelet had coiled itself around her own wrist and sealed itself into place with a soft click. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a serene warmth began to flow into her mind and radiate through her body, enveloping her in a soothing mental embrace. There, said Wendy, withdrawing her arm and lifting her latte to her lips. How do you feel? I'm not sure, said Jenna, still trying to process the supernatural event she had just participated in. What just happened? What just happened is that I've changed your life, or rather, given you the chance to change it, just like I did with mine. If it wasn't for that bracelet, you would never have heard of me. Why not? Because a year ago, I was nobody, a failed singer confined to a mobility scooter, thinking about the life I could have led. That's not true, said Jenna. You've been famous for decades. I have now, but I wasn't then, if that makes any sense, said Wendy. None whatsoever, said Jenna. That's because the timeline and everyone's perception of it, including yours, has been altered. And it was me who changed it, with the bracelet I've just given you. It sent me back to the beginning of 1982, the year I had a shot at fame and blew it. The second time around, knowing what I knew and with the bracelet to guide me, everything was different. And now you've got the chance to do the same. In 1982? Asked Jenna. I can't recall much of significance happening in that year. No, 1983. It moves on a year with each new recipient. You said yourself that was an important year in your life. It was an awful year. The boy I was sweet on was killed at sea. The village was devastated by a flood. My father killed himself. And that monster Blake Cadwallader came to Pencarven and started the process that turned it into what you see today. There you go then. Sounds like you've got plenty to get your teeth into. No wonder the bracelet chose you. It wasn't you then? No, the bracelet led me to come here. It gets inside your head and helps to guide you, when it feels like it. When it feels like it? So it's alive? I'm not sure. It's a bit difficult to explain, and I think it works differently for each person. I hardly used it at all in the latter part of the year, which is how long you'll be there. How old are you? 59, replied Jenna. You'll be 19 when you go back, in your old body. Then, like I say, you'll have the complete calendar year ahead of you to turn things around, with the help of the bracelet. Then you'll come back, hopefully, to a life that is much improved. Mine certainly was. This is a lot to take in, said Jenna, her mind racing with possibilities. I'm sure it is, but you'll have plenty of time to get the hang of it, said Wendy. You're not exactly happy about what's happened to Pencarven, are you? That's the understatement of the year, exclaimed Jenna. Then go back and stop it from happening, and save the ones you love. It's all in your hands. I will, said Jenna with conviction. Not once did she question the fantastical tale Wendy had shared, because the bracelet's comforting warmth made it all seem completely plausible. They talked for a while longer, and Wendy explained a little more about the mechanics of how the bracelet worked, how it was invisible to all but the wearer. By the time they finished, Jenna had enjoyed 3 coffees and a welcome slice of fancy Italian cake, the name of which she couldn't remember. Much as she might want to malign the coffee shop that had usurped the former cafe, she had to admit it was delicious. And now I must go, said Wendy, 2 hours after they arrived. I want to be back in Oxford by tonight, and you need to prepare. Find out as much as you can about 1983 before you go back at midnight. It could prove useful. I'm not sure how, said Jenna. My phone battery is dead and my electricity's been cut off. By tonight, I have to vacate my caravan or I'll be forcibly removed. No problem, said Wendy. I booked my accommodation for 2 nights. It was the minimum they would allow. But I've no desire to hang around here with all these pretentious bastards. I'm seeing in the new year back home with Emily and Benny, so you can stay there instead. She raised her voice with the words pretentious bastards, just loud enough for a smartly dressed couple at a nearby table to hear. They had been casting disparaging looks at Jenna's appearance the whole time they had been there, which hadn't gone unnoticed by Wendy, who had no time for people adopting a superior attitude. She'd had enough of that in the early days in her band. Are you sure? Said Jenna, her reluctance to accept help still stubbornly in place. But then she glanced at the bracelet, which was pulsing a soft green light back at her from a central jewel in its design. Instinctively, she knew it was telling her that this was all going to be okay. I can't use it and it's already paid for, said Wendy. And you sound like you need it. Just relax, charge your phone, find out as much as you can about 1983, and then go back and change your life. Thank you, said Jenna gratefully, already feeling a spark of excitement for what lay ahead. Wendy's accommodation turned out to be one of the old fishermen's cottages just off the harbour front, and not just any cottage. It was the one where Alfie had lived with his father Ned back in the early 1980s. Back then, she remembered it being a rather ramshackle affair, but it was unrecognisable now, having been completely modernised. A leather sofa, plush soft furnishings, and a large 4K television made for an extremely welcoming living room. It's luxurious, remarked Jenna. So different to the last time I was in here, nearly 40 years ago. So it bloody should be at 300 quid a night, said Wendy. No wonder indigenous folk can't afford to live here. Anyway, it's all yours. Don't thank me, thank the bracelet. And now I must get going. The two women bade each other farewell, leaving Jenna alone in the cottage. It was only then that she discovered a well-stocked fridge and a bottle of chilled white wine. Wendy must have known somehow that she was going to end up here and had provided for her accordingly. She wished her benefactor could have stayed. She liked Wendy and would have enjoyed the company. Perhaps she could look her up when she got back. She realised then that she didn't have her phone charger. It was back at the caravan. So despite the welcome comfort of the cottage, she needed to make one last trek up the hill in the cold. As she stepped inside the desolate caravan, she was reminded of all the hardships she had endured. Looking around at what she had been reduced to, she vowed that she would do exactly what Wendy had told her. There was no way she was going to let herself or any of the others in the village who had struggled like she had to go through any of that again. As she closed the caravan door for the last time, a wicked impulse flickered in her mind. She could torch it and watch the flames consume the place that had been her final refuge. Then, when Elliot came the next morning, he'd have the shock of thinking his half-sister had perished in the fire. But would he even care? Probably not, but that wasn't the only reason why it wasn't worth bothering. Because if Jenna achieved what she was already planning to do, then Elliot Cadwallader would not be coming to tow away the caravan the next morning. Because Elliot Cadwallader would no longer exist.